Serena thought she had escaped him. She was wrong. The cathedral was silent as the priest asked, "If anyone objects to this holy union, speak now." No one moved. Then the doors slammed open. A man in a charcoal suit stepped inside. He didn't look at the groom. He looked at the bride. "Stop the music," he said calmly. "The lady is already spoken for." The stained glass of the grand cathedral cast fractured patterns of crimson and violet across the ivory aisle, but to Serena, the colors felt like bruises. Every inch of the sanctuary screamed of old money and unyielding power. This was the wedding of the decade, a calculated spectacle designed to cement the legacy of Marcus Thorne. As a titan of the tech industry and a rising star in the political sphere, Marcus didn't just throw events, he staged coronations. The guest list was a lethal combination of senators, venture capitalists, and socialites, all dressed in silks that shimmered like oil on water. They whispered behind manicured hands about how Serena, a woman of striking beauty and mysterious origins, had managed to capture the heart of the nation's most eligible bachelor. To the world, she was the luckiest woman alive. To Serena, she was a ghost entering a tomb. She stood at the altar, her breath coming in shallow, disciplined hitches. Her reflection in the polished marble floor was that of a queen, draped in hand-stitched silk that clung to her curves and a veil that trailed behind her like a shroud. But beneath the layers of expensive fabric, her skin was cold. Marcus stood beside her, the embodiment of success in his custom tuxedo. He was a man who moved with the predatory grace of someone who owned the air he breathed. When he reached out to take her hand, his fingers didn't offer comfort. They clamped around hers with a proprietary firmness that reminded her of a golden handcuff. He leaned in, his voice a low murmur meant only for her ears, smooth as velvet and sharp as a razor. "Smile, Serena. The cameras are watching, and we've paid too much for this day for you to look like a victim." Serena forced her lips to curve, a practiced mask of bridal bliss that never reached her eyes. Marcus thought he had bought her. In a way, he had. He offered her the one thing the underworld couldn't, a new identity. By marrying him, Serena Vance would cease to exist, and Serena Thorne would be born, a woman too prominent to be kidnapped, too public to be murdered. She was trading one cage for another, betting that the high society glare of Marcus's world would be bright enough to blind the monsters from her past. She looked out at the sea of faces in the pews, seeing nothing but strangers who worshipped the altar of Marcus's wealth. None of them knew that the woman in the white dress was a runaway, a witness, a survivor. The air in the cathedral grew heavy, the scent of 1,000 lilies turning cloying and sickly. Every tick of the clock felt like a hammer blow against the silence of her soul. She had spent 3 years scrubbing the scent of gunpowder and expensive cigars from her memory, trying to forget the gravelly voice of a man who ruled the city's shadows. Marcus represented the clean life, a world of press releases, charity galas, and sterile boardrooms. He was the exit ramp she had prayed for. Yet as the priest began the traditional opening, Serena felt a frantic pulse in her throat. The security detail at the back of the room stood like statues, their earpieces glinting under the chandeliers. Marcus had promised her safety, but as she looked at his cold, triumphant profile, she realized he didn't want to protect her. He wanted to collect her. She was the final piece of his perfect image, the beautiful Black Queen to sit beside his throne. The ceremony was moving forward with the inevitability of a guillotine blade, and for a terrifying second, Serena wondered if she had made a mistake. She had run from the fire only to realize she was standing in a furnace. The scent of the lilies at the altar suddenly soured, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of rain on hot Chicago pavement and the heavy aroma of expensive tobacco. For a heartbeat, the cathedral vanished, and Serena was back in the belly of the beast. 3 years ago, she hadn't been a bride in white. She had been the ghost of the Sartori family, a high-stakes translator who could navigate 5 languages and the even more treacherous dialects of the criminal underworld. She was the only person Luca Sartori trusted to sit in the room when the cartels came to negotiate, her voice the steady bridge between life and death. Luca had been a storm held in check by a tailored suit. He was a man of jagged edges and silent commands, his presence enough to chill the air in a room before he even spoke. Serena had told herself she was there for the money, for the thrill, for the proximity to a power that made the rest of the world look like a toy. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. She was drawn to the fire. It had all come to a head on a jagged pier in the dead of winter, during a deal that had gone south before the first crate was even opened. The air had exploded in a symphony of gunfire and shattered glass. Serena remembered the slip of her heels on the wet wood, the roar of the lake, and the terrifying certainty that her story ended there. Then came the weight of him. Luca hadn't called for his men. He had moved with a feral, singular focus, his body shielding hers as he dragged her behind a wall of rusted shipping containers. He had pinned her against the cold steel, his hand over her mouth to stifle her panicked breathing, his own heart thundering against her chest. In that breathless, terrifying silence, with bullets whining overhead, he had looked down at her. His eyes weren't those of a monster. They were the eyes of a man who was horrified by the thought of a world without her in it. "Stay down," he had hissed, his thumb grazing her jawline for a fraction of a second, a gesture of possessive tenderness that burned deeper than any wound. "If they want you, they have to go through me, and I don't plan on dying today." He had cleared the path with a brutal, efficient violence that left her trembling, but it wasn't the blood that had scared her. It was the realization that she had seen the man behind the myth. She had seen the vulnerability in the King of the Shadows, and in their world, knowing a man's heart was as good as holding the gun to it. Luca Sartori didn't just protect what was his, he consumed it. She saw the way he looked at her after that night, not as an employee, but as his North Star. She knew then that loving him was a death sentence, either by a rival's bullet or by the sheer weight of his devotion. She had fled within 48 hours, leaving no note, no trail, and a hole in the heart of the Sartori empire. She had spent a year in hiding and another 2 building the fragile, porcelain life she now shared with Marcus Thorne. She thought she had buried the ghost of Chicago under layers of respectability and tech industry galas. But as the memory faded and the cathedral's choir resumed their soft, angelic hum, Serena felt the cold realization that some debts are never truly settled. She had run to Marcus to escape the darkness, but as she glanced at the heavy oak doors at the back of the church, she felt the phantom pressure of Luca's hand against her jaw. The past wasn't dead. It was just waiting for the right moment to stand up. The heavy thud of the cathedral doors hitting the stone walls didn't just break the silence. It shattered the carefully constructed illusion of Serena's new life. The congregation, a sea of silk and expensive cologne, turned as one, their collective gasp caught in their throats. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very shadows Serena had tried to outrun. Luca Sartori didn't enter the room with a weapon drawn or a shout of defiance. He didn't need to. He simply stepped forward, his charcoal suit absorbing the light of 1,000 flickering candles, his presence expanding to fill every hollow corner of the high-arched ceiling. Every step he took on the marble aisle was deliberate, a rhythmic, terrifying heartbeat that silenced the organ and froze the air. Serena felt the blood drain from her extremities, leaving her fingers numb against the bouquet of white roses she held. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a jagged second, the 3 years of hiding vanished. Luca wasn't looking at the grandeur of the church or the elite crowd. He was looking at her with a searing intensity that made her wedding veil feel like a transparent lie. He looked older, his jawline harder, but the predator's grace was unchanged. He moved with the terrifying calm of a man who had already decided the ending of the story. Beside her, Marcus Thorne's composure cracked, the polished statesman. The tech visionary who prided himself on being the smartest man in any room recoiled as if he'd been struck. His face contorted into a mask of indignant fury, his eyes darting to the perimeter of the room. Marcus raised a hand, a sharp, frantic gesture directed at the 4 massive security detail stationed near the altar, men handpicked for their lethality and loyalty to the Thorne Empire. "Get him out of here," Marcus hissed, his voice cracking the sanctity of the moment. "I don't care who he is. Remove him now." But the men didn't move. They stood like statues of salt, their gazes fixed firmly on the floor or the far walls, anywhere but on the man walking toward them. These were men who lived in the real world, the world where names like Sartori weren't whispered. They were feared as forces of nature. They knew that to lay a hand on Luca was to sign a death warrant for their entire families. One of the guards, a man Serena had seen break a heavy wooden table with a single blow, actually stepped back, his hand trembling as he touched his earpiece, receiving only static and silence from the teams outside. The perimeter had already fallen without a single shot being fired. The power shift in the room was instantaneous and absolute. Marcus, with all his billions and political connections, suddenly looked small, a petulant child playing dress-up in a world he didn't truly understand. The gilded cage he had built for Serena was melting under the heat of Luca's arrival. As Luca reached the midway point of the aisle, he slowed his pace, his eyes never wavering from Serena's pale face. He wasn't a guest, and he wasn't a ghost. He was the owner of the debt she thought she'd canceled. The priest, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, clutched his leather-bound book to his chest, his knuckles white. The holy ground they stood on had suddenly become a battlefield, and the only person with the armor to survive it was the man who had just walked through the door. "You're late, Marcus," Luca said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried to the very back of the hall. It wasn't a shout, it was a statement of fact. "You're holding a ceremony for something that doesn't belong to you." The priest, Father Miller, stepped forward, his face a pale mask of righteous indignation that didn't quite reach his panicked eyes. He held his gold-leafed Bible like a shield, his voice trembling as he attempted to reclaim the sanctity of his altar. "This is a house of God, sir. You cannot simply march in here and disrupt a holy sacrament. Whatever business you have with these people, it must wait until." Luca didn't stop his steady advance until he was mere inches from the older man. The height difference was staggering, the contrast between the priest's white vestments and Luca's midnight dark suit creating a visual of light being swallowed by a black hole. Luca didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he leaned in, his movement fluid and predatory, and whispered a single, short sentence into the priest's ear. The effect was instantaneous. It was as if the air had been sucked out of Father Miller's lungs. His eyes widened, the pupils dilating until they were pinpricks of pure terror. The Bible in his hands shook so violently that the gilded pages rustled like dry leaves in a storm. He didn't argue. He didn't call for help. He simply took 3 jagged steps backward, his heels catching on the hem of his robe as he retreated into the shadows of the high altar. The realization hit Serena like a physical blow. Luca's reach didn't stop at city limits or warehouse districts. It went behind the pulpit, into the ledgers of the church, and into the secrets the priest had thought were buried under the seal of confession. Serena stood frozen, caught in a dead zone between 2 men who were both, in their own ways, her captors. To her right stood Marcus, his face purple with a rage that was stripping away his polished, perfect husband exterior. He was breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists, looking less like a protector and more like a man whose most expensive possession was being stolen in front of his eyes. To her left was Luca, the monster she had fled, standing with a terrifying, calm certainty that made the entire cathedral feel like his personal living room. The silence that followed was more deafening than the organ's music had been. The elite guests in the pews were no longer witnesses to a wedding, they were spectators to a hit. Serena felt the isolation of the altar. She was no longer a bride. She was a prize, a piece of disputed territory between a man who bought his power with tech shares and a man who took it with blood. Luca's gaze shifted from the retreating priest back to Serena, his expression softening just enough to be dangerous. In that moment, she realized the church was no sanctuary. There was no God here today, only the man who had walked through the doors and the man who was too afraid to stop him. The silence that followed the priest's retreat was a jagged blade, and Marcus Thorne was the first to bleed. The statesmanlike composure that had made him a darling of the evening news disintegrated in an instant, replaced by a frantic, ugly desperation. He lunged toward Serena, grabbing her arm with a force that made her wince, his fingers digging into the delicate silk of her sleeve. His face was no longer the smooth mask of a tech visionary. It was a contorted map of panic and wounded pride. "Serena, tell this street thug to get out of my church," he screamed, his voice cracking and echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Call the police, do something. He's a criminal, a nothing. Tell him you belong to me." Serena looked at Marcus, and for the first time she didn't see a savior. She saw a man drowning in his own insecurity, but before she could speak, Luca moved. He didn't strike. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket and pulled out a slim, black leather folder. With a flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto the marble altar. It landed with a dull thud, sliding across the surface until it came to rest against the gold-plated chalice. "Open it, Serena," Luca said, his voice as cool and steady as a mountain stream. "See what a billionaire's soul really looks like." Marcus tried to swipe the folder away, but Luca's hand shot out, catching Marcus's wrist in a grip that looked effortless but made the groom gasp in pain. "Don't," Luca warned, his eyes flashing with a cold, predatory light. "You've done enough acting for one lifetime." With trembling fingers, Serena reached for the folder. She flipped it open, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Spread across the pages were high-resolution photographs, images that shouldn't have existed. They weren't photos of tech boardrooms or political fundraisers. They were grainier, taken in the dim light of back-alley docks and windowless warehouses. In every shot, Marcus Thorne was there. He wasn't a victim, he was a partner. He was shaking hands with the very men Serena had fled from in Chicago, the rival syndicate that had put a price on her head the moment she walked away from the Sartori empire. The blood in Serena's veins turned to ice as she scanned the documents beneath the photos. Ledger entries, wire transfers, and a signed contract that made her stomach churn. Marcus hadn't stumbled upon her by accident in that high-end gallery 3 years ago. He hadn't pursued her because of her wit or her beauty. He had been hired. His massive debts, hidden behind shell companies and offshore accounts, had been bought by the people who wanted Serena dead. He was her warden, not her husband. The wedding wasn't a fresh start. It was a transition of custody. The gilded cage wasn't a metaphor, it was a literal agreement. Marcus was supposed to keep her in the public eye, neutralized and monitored, until the heat died down enough for them to make her disappear forever. "He was never your exit ramp, Serena," Luca said, stepping closer until he was standing directly in front of her, ignoring Marcus's muffled whimpers of protest. "He was the man holding the door open for your executioners. They paid for the ring, they paid for the dress, and they were going to pay for your funeral." Serena looked up from the folder, her eyes burning with a mixture of betrayal and a terrifying new clarity. She looked at Marcus, who was now trembling, his perfect gentleman persona nothing more than a pile of rags at his feet. The man she thought was her protector was the very person who had been sharpening the knife. She looked at the guests, the elite who had come to celebrate a lie, and then finally she looked at Luca. The monster from her past was the only one in the room who hadn't lied to her. The mask hadn't just fallen. It had shattered, leaving Serena standing in the wreckage of her own life. The reality of the situation crashed over Serena like the icy waters of Lake Michigan, leaving her gasping in the stagnant air of the cathedral. She looked at Marcus, the man she had shared a bed with, the man she had trusted with her deepest anxieties, and saw him for the first time without the filter of her own desperation. He wasn't the brilliant innovator who had rescued her from a life of shadows. He was a scavenger, a man who had leveraged her life to settle his own balances. The safety he had provided was nothing more than the careful maintenance of a high-value asset. Every "I love you," every promise of a quiet life, had been a calculated move in a game where she was the only one who didn't know the rules. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, the sound of rustling silk like the dry hiss of a snake. They had come to witness a fairy tale, but the story had warped into something far more visceral. Serena felt a wave of nausea as she realized that her entire existence for the past 3 years had been a curated lie. Marcus hadn't loved her. He had audited her. He had monitored her movements not out of concern, but out of a contractual obligation to the very monsters she saw in her nightmares. The realization hit the audience in the pews with the same force. The hero of the day, the pillar of the community, was a man who traded in human lives to save his own skin. Luca stood like a pillar of granite, watching the truth sink into her bones. He didn't gloat. He didn't offer a triumphant smirk. He simply stood there, his presence a jarring contrast to the crumbling man beside her. In this twisted theater, the roles had flipped with a violent snap. The villain she had spent years running from was the only one who had respected her enough to bring the truth to her feet, while the savior she had run to was the one holding the leash. "You were going to hand me over," Serena whispered, her voice trembling but gaining a sharp, dangerous edge. "All those nights you told me I was safe. You were just waiting for the check to clear." Marcus's eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape that wasn't there. His silence was the loudest confession of all. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. The evidence in the folder was a map of his treachery, detailed in cold numbers and incriminating images. The man who stood before the world as a beacon of black excellence and success was revealed to be a hollow shell, a puppet dancing on the strings of the Sartori family's enemies. Serena felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. The fear that had dictated her life for 3 years began to crystallize into a quiet, burning rage. She realized that the monsters weren't just the men with guns in Chicago. They were the men in tailored tuxedos who smiled at you while they calculated your worth on a balance sheet. Luca moved a step closer, not to seize her, but to anchor the moment. He was the dark truth in a room full of bright lies. For the first time since she had fled the pier in the winter, Serena stopped looking for a place to hide and started looking at the man who had actually seen her. The villain had come to burn down her cage, and as she looked at the wreckage of her wedding, she realized she was finally ready to let it burn. The heavy silence of the cathedral was broken only by the rhythmic strike of Luca's boots as he finally stepped onto the elevated marble of the altar. Up close, the collision of their two worlds was jarring. Marcus stood there, a symbol of the black elite, his skin shimmering under the expensive warmth of the chandeliers, dressed in a tuxedo that whispered of old money aspirations and corporate boardrooms. Facing him was Luca, a man of cold marble and iron, his pale features set in a mask of grim permanence that spoke of back alleys, blood oaths, and a power that didn't need a bank statement to prove its existence. It was the boardroom versus the street, the polished lie versus the brutal truth, and the tension between them vibrated like a wire pulled to the breaking point. Marcus tried to stand his ground, puffing out his chest to reclaim some semblance of the authority he had possessed only moments ago. "You think you can just walk in here?" Marcus hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and entitlement. "This is a private event. You are a ghost, Sartori, a relic of a world that has no place here." Luca didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge Marcus's outburst with a glance. Instead, he stood so close to the groom that Marcus was forced to tilt his head back, the physical disparity highlighting the difference between a man who bought muscle and a man who was the muscle. Luca looked down at him with a weary kind of contempt, the way a lion looks at a jackal caught scavenging at the edge of his territory. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, Luca turned his back on Marcus entirely, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded furniture. He turned his full attention to Serena. The air between them seemed to warp, the heat of their shared history melting the distance she had worked so hard to maintain. Up close, she could see the faint silver scar near his temple, a souvenir from the night he had saved her, and the raw, unblinking honesty in his dark eyes. He didn't reach for her. He didn't try to grab her hand or pull her away from the man she had promised to marry. He simply stood there, an immovable force of nature, and allowed her to see him. "Serena," he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very stones beneath her feet. "I know what you think this is. You think I've come to drag you back to the basement of the world. You think I've come to claim a debt." He took a single step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear, though it carried the weight of a decree. "But I didn't come here to kidnap you. I didn't come to force you into another cage, no matter how much more honest mine might be." He gestured vaguely toward the folder on the altar, toward the shattered remains of her illusion. "I came because you were about to sign your life away to a man who had already sold it. I came to give you the keys to your own life. What you do with them, whether you stay in this ruin or walk out those doors, is the first real choice you've had since the night you left Chicago." The weight of his words settled over her, heavier than the silk of her gown. For 3 years, Serena had been a piece on a chessboard, moved by fear or manipulated by Marcus's carefully constructed safety. Now, standing between the man who had lied to protect his bank account and the man who had risked a war to bring her the truth, she felt the dizzying, terrifying rush of actual freedom. Luca wasn't offering her a hand to hold. He was offering her the floor to stand on. He was the monster who had broken her chains, leaving her standing alone in the light of a truth she never wanted to see. The silence in the cathedral had reached a fever pitch, the kind of stillness that precedes a lightning strike. Luca stood perfectly still, his hand finally extending toward her, palm up, an invitation rather than a command. It was a call to the wild, a gesture that promised nothing but the truth and the terrifying uncertainty of the road ahead. "If you stay," Luca said, his voice cutting through the stagnant air like a cooling wind, "you stay with a man who is already a ghost." Marcus's debts aren't just financial, Serena. They are blood deep. If you tie your name to his today, the people he owes will come to collect from you. This life, this status, this safety. It's a house built on sand, and the tide is already coming in. Serena looked at Marcus. He was shaking now, the sweat beading on his forehead and ruining the line of his expensive foundation. He looked like a man watching his last asset liquidate in real time. "Serena, don't listen to him," Marcus hissed, a desperate, pathetic edge to his voice. "Think about what you're throwing away. The foundations, the influence, the respect. You'll be a pariah. You'll have nothing." She looked back at Luca. "And if I leave?" "If you leave," Luca replied, his eyes never wavering, "you leave it all. The dress, the diamonds, the thorn name. You walk out of here with nothing but the truth and whatever courage you have left. I won't promise you a palace and I won't promise you peace, but I will promise you that no one will ever own you again." Serena felt the eyes of the elite guests burning into her back, the senators, the CEOs, the people who had spent the morning admiring her like a piece of fine art. To them, she was a scandal in the making. To Marcus, she was a shield. To Luca, she was a woman who had been running for too long. She looked down at the 5-carat diamond on her left hand. It was a beautiful, cold stone that felt like a brand. It represented the perfect life Marcus had sold her. A life that was meant to end in a shallow grave once the Sartori enemies were satisfied. The choice was no longer between two men. It was between a comfortable lie and a dangerous freedom. Serena reached up and slowly, deliberately, pulled back her veil, letting the fine lace fall to the marble floor like a discarded skin. The gasp from the front row was audible, but she didn't care. With a steady hand, she twisted the heavy platinum band off her finger. Marcus reached out, his face a mask of horror. "Serena, wait." She didn't wait. She stepped toward the small table where a crystal glass of vintage champagne sat, poured for the toast that would now never happen. With a flick of her wrist, she dropped the ring. It hit the liquid with a soft, melodic clink, sinking through the bubbles to the bottom of the glass. The symbol of Marcus's ownership sat submerged in the amber liquid, a sunken treasure from a dead empire. "The wedding is over, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to the furthest corners of the vaulted ceiling. "And so is the debt." She turned away from the altar, leaving the groom standing in the wreckage of his own deception. She didn't look at the shocked faces in the pews or the priest who had shrunk into the shadows. She looked only at the man in the charcoal suit. She didn't take his hand, not yet. She simply stepped beside him, her head held high, the heavy silk of her train whispering against the stone as she prepared to walk out of the only safety she had ever known and into the beautiful, terrifying unknown. The descent from the altar was not the retreat Marcus had expected, nor was it the scandalous flight the congregation anticipated. It was a procession. As Serena stepped down the marble stairs, she felt the weight of the world shifting beneath her feet. The train of her $1,000 gown, once a symbol of her status as the future Mrs. Thorne, now hissed against the floor like the skin of a shedding snake. She didn't hurry. She didn't lower her head. She walked with a spine of tempered steel, her gaze fixed on the open oak doors at the end of the long, sun-drenched aisle. Beside her, Luca matched her pace, not leading her, not dragging her, but walking a half-step behind in a gesture of silent, profound respect that spoke louder than any declaration of war. The whispers followed them like a swarm of insects. Serena heard the sharp intakes of breath from women who had envied her an hour ago, and the hushed, panicked murmurs of men who realized the political landscape of the city had just been scorched to the ground. She passed the midpoint of the cathedral, where the light through the stained glass turned her white dress into a canvas of chaotic color. She saw the 4 security guards, Marcus's elite detail, still frozen in place. As she passed them, the lead guard instinctively lowered his head, a silent acknowledgement of the raw power passing through the room. This wasn't a walk of shame. It was an exodus. Serena was leaving behind the jewels, the fake smiles, and the man who had bought her life, and with every step, the suffocating pressure in her chest began to lift. When they reached the threshold, the midday sun hit her with a blinding brilliance. The steps of the cathedral were swarmed with paparazzi and onlookers, their cameras flashing like a volley of gunfire. For a moment, the wall of noise was deafening, but Luca stepped into the light first. He didn't say a word, yet the crowd parted before him with a primal, instinctive fear. He held the door of a matte black SUV open, his eyes meeting hers one last time before they left the world of the civilized behind. There was no triumph in his expression, only a quiet, watchful waiting. He was giving her the final inch of the journey, letting her choose to step into the darkness of her own volition. Serena gathered the heavy silk of her skirt, the fabric now stained with the dust of the cathedral floor, and slid into the cool, leather interior of the vehicle. Luca followed, closing the door and sealing out the screams of the reporters and the frantic shouts of Marcus's lawyers. The glass was heavily tinted, turning the chaos outside into a silent, flickering movie. As the engine hummed to life, and the SUV pulled away from the curb, the adrenaline that had sustained Serena since the doors first opened began to ebb. She leaned her head back against the headrest, closing her eyes. For 3 years, every breath had been measured, every word weighed, every movement monitored by a man who saw her as a trophy to be guarded. Now, the air in the cabin felt different, cleaner, sharper. She felt the car accelerate, weaving through the city traffic, moving toward a destination she couldn't name and a future she couldn't predict. Luca remained silent, staring out the opposite window, giving her the space to exist without his shadow falling over her. Serena let out a long, shuddering exhale, a sound that started in the depths of her soul and ended in a whisper of relief. For the first time since the night on the pier, the ghost of Chicago was gone. Serena was finally, terrifyingly, breathing. As the city skyline blurred into a streak of steel and glass behind them, Serena realized that her escape wasn't just about leaving a wedding. It was about reclaiming a soul she had nearly forgotten. The world had seen her as a woman rescued by a hero, but the truth was far more complex. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes, the person who looks like your savior is actually your captor, and the one you fear the most is the only one with enough respect to tell you the truth. True safety isn't found in a gilded cage or a billionaire's promise. It's found in the courage to walk away from a lie, even when the truth wears a face you once ran from. Serena's journey reminds us that the most dangerous monsters aren't the ones in the shadows. They're the ones standing right beside us, smiling for the cameras. If you found yourself in Serena's shoes, standing at the altar of a life you thought was perfect, only to have the veil torn away at the final second, what would you do? If you found out your partner was keeping a life-changing secret, would you want to know the truth right there in front of everyone? Or would you rather live forever in a beautiful, comfortable lie? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Stories like Serena are a powerful reminder that loyalty is far rarer and much more valuable than diamonds. If this journey gripped you and you want more deep dives into the hidden lives of the powerful and the dangerous, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. We drop a new cinematic story every single week that explores the thin line between love, power, and betrayal, stories you won't want to miss. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.